on his computer. Okay, we're recording, Bob. You're on.
Okay. Well, tonight it should be an interesting lesson. I called it Deja Vu, and that's because chapter 34 of Exodus involves Moses going back up onto the mountain of God and to receive the Ten Commandments again. And if you were asked the question, how many days and nights did Moses spend on the mountain of God? Most of us would answer 40. But if you read this chapter carefully, it's 80. He goes up on the mountain a second time for 40 days and 40 nights.
Yep.
And this is an interesting aspect of something that I've studied Exodus many times in the past, but somehow I just glossed over that fact. We're going to talk, chapter 34 is a difficult chapter. It was difficult for me. It's really a climatical chapter in that it really puts together what the book of Exodus is all about, and that is God's plan of redemption. It's difficult because there's apparent inconsistencies with the way that God deals with Israel and with the way God reveals himself. And we're going to talk about some of these inconsistencies that are really not inconsistencies. It's our understanding of the nature and character of God that is weak, not who God is. When we describe the triune God, we know that the Word of God teaches that God is three personalities, three persons, three in one, if you will. Yet, as many times as we say we understand it, I don't understand it. It's too hard to understand. Well, we're going to have some of these inconsistencies, these things about the nature of God that are hard to understand because we don't have all the knowledge and wisdom. We only have what God has revealed to us, and then we don't understand all the things that God reveals to us. This chapter 34 of Exodus is also a very timely message because we're living in a society right now where it's falling apart. Law and order is not considered to be a virtue when it comes down to the protests and the agenda that people have to try and undo where we've been the last couple of 100 years. And so we're going to talk about what God's kingdom looks like in this chapter. Now, in Exodus 34, 5 through 7, the focus verse that I wanted to start with is verses 5 through 7. And this is when Moses went back up onto the mountain with the stone tablets that God told him to bring with him. And it says, "Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him," that's Moses, "and proclaimed his name, the Lord. The Lord, the Lord, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of their fathers to the third and fourth generation." That's an inconsistency, if I've ever seen one. If I were cross-examining God, I'd say, "God, what do you mean? You say that you can forgive in your loving kindness, but then you're going to visit sins and punish sins up to the third and fourth generation." Well, we're going to talk about that. And as we talk about it, we're going to see Moses as an example or a foreshadowing of what God's ultimate plan was through Jesus Christ. Last week, we distinguished between God's grace, which relates to the blessings which God freely gives, and God's mercy, which relates to the judgments and punishments which God freely withholds. And we see that acting as a mediator for his people, as an intercessor for his people, Moses petitioned the God in two ways. First, he petitioned God not to destroy the Israelites because they worshiped the golden calf. And second, he petitioned God to remain in the presence of his people. Even though he moved the tent of meeting outside the camp, God told him that he would be present with his people on their journey to the promised land. Now, in this chapter, we get God's full reconciliation with the people he chose to be his inheritance. This reconciliation between God and the Israelites was not complete until God completely forgave what they had done and reestablished his covenant relationship with him. This lesson just calls us to learn about the role that God's law fulfills in order to reconcile a holy and just God to a corrupt and sinful man. This is the collision between our holy God and our unholy nature. It's a collision that we have to deal with, and the law is where that collision takes place. We learned that without the law being fulfilled, God in his divine holiness cannot coexist with man in his fallen and corrupt state. God said himself that with the way the stiff-necked Israelites were, if he were to go in their midst, he would end up consuming them. God is a just God and a holy God. Yet there's another inconsistency. We learned in chapter 32 that it's impossible for man to fulfill the requirements of the law. And God knew this when he made the covenant. He knew that man in his corrupt state could not fulfill the requirements of the law. Yet, here in the chapter 34, we see God telling Moses, bring 2 more tablets up. I'm going to write the commandments on them. I'm going to reestablish the covenant. And that covenant, the Sinaitic covenant, is a covenant that says, if you obey, I will bless you. If you disobey, I will punish you. It's a conditional covenant. We know from this lesson that the 10 Commandments, God's law, is the principle by which God governs his people. In other words, God deals with his people with the law and through the law. It is the law that brings this collision together where God has to reconcile the two. God's judicial requirements necessitate the fulfillment of God's law. So the main message that I want you to take away from tonight's lesson is God's law is a governing principle which reconciles our divine and holy God to us as his fallen and corrupt people. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus on the cross isn't our salvation, but God rules his creation. God governs his people. And the way that God governs is through God's law, through God's justice. And we're going to see that Jesus saves, but God still governs. Okay, and so we're going to outline as we're going to talk about God reinstating his moral law with the Israelites. We're going to then talk about God promises even greater miraculous things to come. And then we're going to talk about God being a jealous God. It's going to get us about a third way through chapter 34. Then we'll have the discussion questions and end up with some conclusions. Well, we're going to start with the very first part of chapter 34, where God reinstates his moral law. He first instructs Moses to make 2 stone tablets and take them up to the mountain to present them to God. In Exodus 34, 1 through 4, the scriptures say, the Lord said to Moses, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write them on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning, and then come up on Mount Sinai. Present yourself to me there on top of the mountain. No one is to come with you or to be seen anywhere on the mountain. Not even the flocks and herds may graze in front of the mountain. Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and went up to Mount Sinai early in the morning as the Lord had commanded him. And he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. The first commandments were on stone tablets. God is saying, now that those commandments have been broken, make 2 more similar tablets and bring them up to me. I'm going to write on them in the same manner I wrote on the first ones. Um, the very fact that God is writing the Ten Commandments a second time means that it's significant to God. God's law, moral law, is significant. It's important. And God intends to reinstate the covenant relationship with his people. By writing these same commandments, and where do these tablets end up? They end up in the Ark of the Covenant underneath the mercy seat. And God looks down at the sacrifice of what foreshadows the sacrifice of Jesus. He accepts the sacrifice, and what the law is still in the chest. And so we're going to talk about that as how it applies here. Even though the Israelites are unable to keep the commandments and ended up breaking them over and over again throughout the history of Israel, and they broke them in the very first place by worshiping the gold calf, God requires obedience to his law. That's just a fact. And it applies to the Israelites, it applies to the believers today. Well, why does God require his people to be obedient to God's law when it's impossible for them to do so? The answer really lies in the character and purpose of God himself, which is partially revealed in this chapter of Exodus. God is holy. God's holiness is reflected in his absolute righteousness and his administration of justice. God's holy law is a manifestation of his holiness and his righteousness. That's why in the New Testament, when we talk about the book of Romans, Paul is saying the law is holy. The law is good. It reflects the very nature of God's righteousness and judgment. It's comforting for us to know that the God of our universe is a God of law and order. Have we heard that lately? The Ten Commandments are essential in God's government, in his governing system, in his administration of justice, that there is law and order in his creation. Now, what's interesting in chapter 34 is that God's law, the Ten Commandments, distinguishes the divine, holy God, the character of God, from the fallen and corrupt nature of man. It divides it. It's that sword that divides it. God's law defines our corruption, and God's law is holy, and we are not. And so when we talk about the character of God, sometimes we get confused because we try to apply what we do with ourselves and apply it to God. When we talk about God's character, we're talking about the sum total of every attribute that God has. And we could go and we can look at the holiness of God, the goodness of God, the grace of God, the mercy of God, God's wrath, God's righteousness, God's judgment against sin. These are all attributes of God. And there are books that are written that talk about the 32 different attributes of God, but all of them together make up God's character. The difference is that God is all of his attributes all the time. He doesn't sacrifice one attribute in favor of another attribute. And so, in other words, as an example, God does not abandon his holy law in order to show mercy to us. The requirements of the law and the goodness of the law are just as important and equally part of God's character, even when he shows mercy to those he chose to be his inheritance. He doesn't sacrifice his goodness when he punishes sin. So this is something that we're not used to as human beings because we're not like God. We frequently will forfeit one attribute, one character we have in favor of another characteristics. For instance, we abandon love entirely when we start to selfishly hurt other people. So we are not God. We cannot uphold all of our attributes together and be consistent, but God can. Literally, God can be and do all things all the time. And so we cannot. Now, the verses that follow reveal and explain how God can show his goodness when he extends his mercy and grace, while at the same time he shows his goodness when he punishes sin. That's a mouthful, because frankly, that's hard for us as a corrupt people as we are, as sinful as our nature is, for us to understand. But look at what the Lord does here. Then this is the verse that I started out with. The Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with Moses and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of their fathers to the third and fourth generation. So there it is. They appear to contradict each other. But how can God forgive wickedness, rebellion, and sin and still leave the guilty being punished? Instead of, he can't leave the guilty unpunished. What God reveals to Moses is that he has freely decided to extend his mercy, his grace and goodness and love and faithfulness and long suffering toward the Israelites without nullifying his wrath, judgment, and punishment of sin. In other words, he's giving mercy, but he doesn't forfeit his punishment for sin. Well, how does he do both at the same time? Well, let's first look at what Moses did and see why God was willing to do this for the Israelites. Well, recall Moses had not participated in the sin of worshiping the golden calf. He was up on the mountain with God. Israel rejected God's covenant. Recall also that Moses identified with and interceded on behalf of his people, asking God not to destroy the Israelites and asking God to maintain his presence with the Israelites. Lastly, recall that Moses offered his own life if God was not willing to show his mercy and remain faithful to the promise that he made to Abraham. Now we know that even though Moses offered his physical life, God could not accept that. And there lies the answer. Because what we need to do is look at what Moses did and how what Moses did pointed to and foreshadowed what Jesus did on the cross. Atonement for sin requires a sacrifice which is acceptable to God. Although Moses offered himself as a sacrifice, his offer was not acceptable because Moses was sinful, finite, and he's not Jesus. Only Jesus, the unblemished Lamb, could be an acceptable sacrifice to atone for man's sin. The death and sacrifice of Jesus on the cross as the Son of God is the only sacrifice that's acceptable to our divine and holy God. Jesus' death and sacrifice on the cross satisfies the requirements of God's divine and holy law to judge and punish sin. God punished sin. He punished sin by laying it on Christ. Christ bore our sin. Christ bore the punishment for our sin. God meted out his judgment against sin and at the same time accepted the sacrifice in atonement to show his mercy towards his people. That's how it's reconciled. God did not forfeit his judicial requirements. He did not forfeit his law. He fulfilled both. And what did Jesus say? I came to fulfill the law. And that's what he did. In addition, Moses interceded on behalf of the people that he identified with. And Jesus continues to intercede for us. In order for God to show mercy and still keep his holy law, there has to be a sacrifice. Jesus is a sacrifice. And there has to be intercession. And Jesus is the one that interceded for us, just like Moses did for the people of Israel. So once we consider that what Moses did back in the day is what foretold what Jesus did on the cross. In order for God to render his mercy, grace, and goodness to his otherwise corrupt people, there must be an acceptable sacrifice and an acceptable mediator. For the Israelites at the time, it was Moses. For the world and for us today, it's Jesus. And even back then, what Moses did only became perfect through what Jesus Christ later did on the cross. God's justice is dispensed with and his mercy follows. So Moses, he got it. He's up there with God, and God reveals that he's going to be good and merciful to the people of Israel, and yet his requirements of justice and obedience to the law will be maintained. And Moses responds like any of us would. He falls to the ground and worships our Lord. In verses 8 and 9, Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshiped. O Lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, he said, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin and take us as your inheritance. Moses closes the deal. He intercedes for his people. He recognizes what God is doing. He's maintaining his law, but he's also accepting the sacrifice to come, accepting Moses' intercession for the time, and he's giving mercy that follows. But then the interesting part of chapter 34 is the next verses, because God promises even greater miraculous things to come. And verses 10 through 11, he says, then the Lord said, I'm making a covenant with you. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you. Obey what I command you today. I will drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Well, having extended his mercy to the Israelites, God renews his covenant. And then he goes on with this response that says he's going to do even more miraculous things. He's responding to Moses' intercessory petition, but what could possibly be greater than what God already did? What could be greater than the plagues that he rested on Egypt in order to free his people from bondage? What greater things could he do than part the Red Sea and have them go through the sea as on dry ground, and the Israelis are on the other side, and then the waters close upon the Egyptian army? What greater things could God do than to create water out of a rock, to rain manna, and to take care of his people in the wilderness? It's kind of hard to say, what is God talking about here? What can top that show? Well, some scholars interpret these verses as saying that God in these verses is promising to restore Israel at the end of times. And that's when the nation of Israel will be elevated above all other nations, and God assumes his governance as a righteous king. Now, that's a focus on what the greater things that God will do for Israel. We know from the history of Israel, they obey and fall away, obey and fall away. God has the temple destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and then it's rebuilt after the Babylonian captivity, and then in 70 AD it's destroyed again, and the Jews are dispersed. And yet God, we know from Zechariah and some of the other prophecies, Daniel in the Old Testament, that God promises the restoration of Israel. And here in Exodus, God is making reference to that promise. Some scholars think that this is a bigger picture than just Israel, because if you look at the book of Revelations and you look at the seals being opened and what happens to the earth, it's much worse than what happened to Egypt. We have a third of mankind being destroyed. We have the climatic battle of Armageddon. We have the plagues almost revisited during the book of Revelations. And what comes after that is the restoration or the completion of God's plan of redemption, the millennium and the rule of God on earth. When you look at this, there's one other thing that I see in this promise that God is making. And that is this. Someday, God is going to return mankind to how we existed with God before the fall. Back to the garden, if you will. God promises that there'll be a day where not only are we free from the penalty of sin, and we're going to also be free from the presence of sin. And we're going to live with God as his holy people, where we are going to be able to fulfill the law, because God is going to put the law in our hearts, and he is going to free us from the bondage of sin. And so we can really fulfill the law in the end times. And I think that that promise is more wondrous, more miraculous, more powerful than anything, because as much as I would like to believe that I can become a better person and that I can be free of sin, what does James say? If you say that you don't sin, you're a liar. We are caught up in sin. Every time we turn around, we are corrupted by the sin around us. We're seeing the sin of mankind destroying our society around us. We see how it invades our churches and how false prophets come forward. But there's going to be a day when God's law is fulfilled, and we are going to be God's holy people because the law will be written on our hearts. So what about the meantime? In Exodus 34, verses 12 through 17, God says to his people, "Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going. They will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, they will invite you and you will eat their sacrifices. And when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same. Do not make cast iron idols." God is warning Israel of exactly what's going to happen to Israel and what is happening to us today. As more and more people reject God, as more and more people in our society turn away God, as more and more people attack the church and attack God, a lot of us are going to be corrupted by the sin around us. God says that we need to keep ourselves holy. We need to turn to God. We need to have Jesus intercede for us, and we need to work through the church to upgrade us, to keep us from falling prey to the snares around us. We're going to end with God is a jealous God. I always thought jealousy was a bad thing, but to God, his jealousy is a possessory thing. God is saying that he's jealous. Well, what is he jealous about? He's jealous about his holiness, his glory. God is saying that I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another. God promises that he will share his glory eventually with us as his holy people, as his inheritance. But God doesn't want to share it with idols, with sinful man. Second, God is a jealous of the affections of his people. How many times do we read in the book of Psalms, or how many times do we hear the prophets lament how God cries over his people rejecting him? God is jealous of the love and affection of the people he's chosen to be his. In Proverbs 23:26, God laments, "My son, give me your heart." Third, God is jealous of his people. We are the apple of God's eye. God is jealous because he's possessory of the people he chooses to as his inheritance. Now, God doesn't need us to be his inheritance. God doesn't need anything to add to who he is, but he chooses us as his inheritance. And in choosing us, he's jealous to protect us. He's jealous to possess us. He's jealous to redeem us. So I think that this lesson gives us a whole insight into the reconciliation of God's law and God's mercy, all around the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. And Moses, what he did in this important chapter of Exodus, foreshadow what our Lord Jesus Christ later did on the cross. So that's the lesson. That's the substantive part of the lesson. I have two great questions. So what we're going to do is I'll ask the question, and if you're prepared to throw out an answer, then be recognized, unmute yourself, and let's have a go at it. Now, how has God satisfied the